No matter how the situation between Russia and Ukraine develops, the European Union as a whole will end up being the largest loser. Geopolitical repercussions as well as economic and well-being shocks are the consequences for European nations. The fact that the percentage of EU businesses experiencing losses increased from the typical average of 8% to 15% in the months following the start of the conflict, and that the percentage of businesses at risk of defaulting on their debt increased from 10% to 17% in the same period, according to the European Investment Bank, says a lot about how much the conflict has affected the European economies as a whole. Russia is such a significant supplier to the global oil and gas markets that the disruption in trade, primarily because of the sanctions against this major supplier, has translated into higher prices, which has led to higher cost of production in a wide range of fields, even though not all European countries heavily depend on Russia for oil and gas. In European nations, this is especially true. The majority of the economic sanctions Washington has imposed on Russia are being felt by those EU nations, such Germany and France, that rely largely on Russia for their oil and gas. As a result, inflation has developed into a scourge that is adversely affecting people's quality of life in EU nations. The costs of several, although not all European countries heavily depend on Russia for oil and gas, Russia is such an important supplier to the international oil and gas markets that the disruption in trade, primarily due to the sanctions against this major supplier, has translated into higher prices, which has led to higher cost of production in a wide range of fields. This is particularly so in European countries. Those EU countries, Germany and France included, which heavily depend on Russia for oil and gas, are bearing the brunt of the economic sanctions that Washington has orchestrated against Russia. As a result, inflation has become a scourge that is having a serious impact on the quality of life of the people in EU countries. The prices of many core products such as wheat, fertilizers and gas are constantly on the rise, and they are expected to rise by 6% this year, according to estimates by experts. The rising prices will stifle demand, which will in turn affect economic growth and push up food and energy prices. It is a vicious cycle for the overall economic situation in EU countries. It makes sense that there have been rallies against military aid to Ukraine in some EU nations, with demonstrators calling for their governments to prioritize meeting the needs of the populace on a daily basis. In fact, the EU's worst inflation in decades has had the greatest impact on the most vulnerable people. The worst conflict to hit the continent since the end of World War II has undone all of the EU's efforts to establish itself as a political force that can keep its distance from the United States. If anything, the EU had accomplished in asserting its own presence as an independent political bloc on the stage of international politics before the conflict began. The US has been able to assert its dominance over the world by starting a proxy war against Russia. It makes sense that protests against military assistance to Ukraine have taken place in certain EU countries, with demonstrators urging their governments to put the needs of the public first. In truth, those who are most vulnerable have been hit hardest by the EU's worst inflation in decades. If anything, the EU had succeeded in asserting its own presence as an independent political bloc on the stage of international politics before the conflict began. However, all of the EU's efforts to establish itself as a political force that can keep its distance from the United States have been undone by the worst conflict to hit the continent since the end of World War II. The US has been able to demonstrate its power.